He thought it would be a harmless joke, a forgettable moment to amuse a room full of refined ears. But as Clara Bennett stepped into the light that evening, something in the air shifted in a way no one could yet explain. The grand recital hall of Ashford Conservatory shimmered under warm golden chandeliers, casting soft reflections across polished mahogany floors that had carried the footsteps of prodigies for over a century. And seated beneath that glow were donors in tailored suits, faculty with distinguished reputations, and students who had spent years clawing their way toward recognition, all gathered for what was supposed to be a flawless night of music, yet just beyond the velvet curtains, moving quietly. Between music stands and instrument cases, Clara Bennett remained invisible, her simple gray cardigan and modest posture blending seamlessly into the background, as though she were just another staff member ensuring perfection for others, not someone meant to stand beneath the spotlight herself. And perhaps that was exactly how she preferred it, because for weeks she had passed through these halls unnoticed, her presence acknowledged only when something needed arranging or fixing, her soft voice rarely rising above a polite "yes, of course," as professors hurried past her without a second glance, unaware that the woman they dismissed so easily carried a stillness that did not come from insignificance, but from something far deeper, something carefully hidden. And on this particular evening, as the final rehearsal adjustments echoed faintly from the stage, a subtle tension began to ripple through the backstage corridors when word spread that the featured pianist, a celebrated young virtuoso, had fallen ill just moments before the performance, leaving the program in sudden jeopardy. Whispers traveled quickly, voices sharp and urgent, faculty exchanging concerned looks while assistants scrambled for solutions. And at the center of that growing unease stood Maestro Leonard Halvorsen, a man whose reputation alone could command silence, his silver hair perfectly set, his tuxedo immaculate, his baton resting lightly between his fingers like an extension of his authority. And though his expression remained composed, there was an unmistakable edge in his gaze as he assessed the situation, calculating, decisive, unwilling to allow chaos to disrupt the evening's prestige, until his eyes drifted, almost absent-mindedly, toward Clara, who had paused near the piano bench while adjusting a stack of sheet music. And in that brief moment, an idea flickered across his face, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of idea that carried both convenience and quiet. "Amusement, you," he said, his voice calm but carrying across the room with practiced ease. And Clara looked up, startled, as though the word itself had reached her from a distance she hadn't expected to cross. "You've been around the instruments all week, haven't you?" he continued, his tone measured, almost casual, yet beneath it lingered a trace of something else. Something the nearby professors quickly picked up on as they exchanged faint smiles. Sensing what was about to unfold, Clara hesitated, her fingers still resting lightly on the edge of the piano. "I assist with preparation," she replied softly, careful, respectful, her voice barely rising above the hum of backstage activity. And that was when one of the instructors let out a quiet chuckle, quickly masked but not entirely hidden. "Well then," the maestro said, stepping closer, his presence filling the space with quiet authority, "perhaps you can assist us a little more tonight." And the words hung in the air for just a second longer than they should have, long enough for the intention behind them to settle into the room, long enough for the surrounding staff to realize that this was not a solution born of necessity alone, but something else entirely, something that would soon draw every eye in that grand hall toward a woman no one had thought to notice. And as Clara stood there, caught between expectation and silence, the faint echo of distant applause drifted through the curtains from the audience beyond, unaware that the performance they had come to witness was about to become something none of them would ever forget. And in that quiet moment before anything began, before a single note was played, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the room already sensed that what was about to happen would not go the way anyone expected. The moment the maestro's words settled into the air, a subtle shift passed through the room, the kind that could not be heard but was felt in the tightening of shoulders and the faint exchange of glances among those who understood exactly what was unfolding. And Clara Bennett felt it too, not as humiliation yet, but as a quiet pressure pressing inward, urging her either to step forward or disappear entirely. Yet there was no space left for disappearing now, not with several instructors already watching her with thinly veiled curiosity, not with a pair of students whispering just loudly enough for their amusement to carry, and certainly not with Maestro Halvorsen standing only a few feet away, his expression composed but his eyes studying her as though she were a variable in an equation he had already solved. "It is a simple accompaniment," he added, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Nothing beyond basic familiarity." And a few of the faculty members allowed themselves faint smiles, the kind that did not reach their eyes, because everyone in that room knew the piece scheduled for that evening was anything but simple. It was intricate, demanding, layered with technical precision that even advanced students struggled to master. And yet here it was being reduced to something trivial, offered to a woman who had never once been seen performing, and Clara's fingers curled slightly at her sides, not from fear alone, but from the recognition of what this moment truly was. A test not meant to be passed, but to be witnessed, a quiet spectacle designed to remind everyone present of the invisible lines that separated those who belonged from those who did not. And as the silence stretched, one of the younger instructors leaned toward another and murmured, "This should be interesting." The words soft but sharp enough to land, while somewhere behind them a student suppressed a laugh, quickly disguising it as a cough. And still Clara did not move, her gaze resting briefly on the polished surface of the piano just beyond the curtain, the same instrument she had dusted carefully earlier that afternoon, the same keys she had touched only in passing, never with intention, never with an audience. And yet something in her expression began to change, subtle but unmistakable, as though a door long closed had just been nudged open from the inside. "Well?" the maestro prompted, his voice calm but edged now with expectation, and that was when Clara finally nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion that nonetheless carried weight, because it was not agreement in the way they assumed. It was not submission to their quiet amusement. It was something steadier, something chosen, and without another word she stepped forward, moving past the cluster of onlookers who instinctively shifted aside, their curiosity sharpening as she passed. And with each step the distant hum of the audience beyond the curtains grew clearer, a low murmur of anticipation that had nothing to do with her. Not yet. And as she reached the edge of the stage entrance, the light from the hall spilled toward her in a warm glow, outlining her silhouette against the darker corridor behind. And for a brief moment she paused, her hand brushing lightly against the side of the grand piano, as though reacquainting herself with something familiar, something long untouched, while behind her the whispers continued, softer now, but still present. "She is going to freeze out there," one voice said under its breath. "This will be over in seconds," another replied, confident, dismissive, and the maestro, standing just behind, adjusted his grip on the baton, already preparing to guide the inevitable failure into something passable, something that would preserve the evening's dignity. Even as he did, there was a flicker of something else in his gaze, something he did not yet understand, because Clara Bennett, the quiet woman no one had noticed, was no longer moving like someone uncertain of her place. And as she stepped fully into the light of the stage, the murmuring audience gradually settled, unaware that the performance they were about to witness had already begun in a way none of them could see. And in that suspended moment before she reached the bench, before a single note had been played, the room seemed to hold itself in a fragile balance, as if waiting for something it could not yet name. As Clara Bennett stepped fully into the glow of the stage lights, the vast recital hall revealed itself in its full grandeur, rows upon rows of velvet seats stretching back beneath crystal chandeliers that shimmered like frozen stars. And for a brief moment the audience regarded her with polite confusion, programs rustling softly as heads tilted and brows furrowed, searching for a name that was not printed anywhere on the evening schedule. And the silence that followed was not yet the silence of awe, but of uncertainty, the kind that precedes either disappointment or surprise. And somewhere in the front row a patron leaned toward another and whispered, "Is this part of the program?" While a student in the balcony suppressed a quiet chuckle, the sound barely contained but unmistakable in its tone. And still Clara continued forward without haste, her steps measured, neither hurried nor hesitant, as though she had walked this path before in another time, another life. And as she reached the piano bench, she paused once more, her fingers hovering just above the polished surface of the instrument, reflecting the golden light in soft ripples, and behind her, Maestro Halvorsen lifted his baton with practiced precision, his posture straight, his expression composed. Yet beneath that calm exterior lingered a faint trace of anticipation, not for brilliance, but for the predictable unfolding of a moment he believed he already understood, and the orchestra members exchanged subtle glances, some adjusting their instruments, others watching Clara with curiosity that bordered on skepticism, because nothing about her appearance aligned with what they had been trained to expect from someone stepping into such a role. And yet there she was, standing at the center of it all, unannounced, unrecognized, and completely still, until finally she lowered herself onto the bench, the soft creak of the wood barely audible in the vast space, and placed her hands gently in her lap, not yet touching the keys, not yet acknowledging the expectation pressing down from every direction. And in that suspended moment, time itself seemed to stretch, the murmurs fading, the air growing heavier, as if the room were quietly asking a question no one dared to speak aloud. And Clara closed her eyes, just for a second, long enough for a flicker of something distant to pass across her expression, something that did not belong to this room or this night, a memory perhaps, or a feeling too deep to name. And when she opened them again, there was a steadiness there that had not been present before, a quiet clarity that shifted something intangible in the atmosphere, though no one could yet explain why. And Maestro Halvorsen gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, signaling readiness, his baton poised in midair, waiting for the inevitable hesitation, the missed cue, the confirmation of what everyone expected to see. But Clara did not look at him, did not seek guidance or permission. Instead, her gaze rested softly on the keys before her, as though reacquainting herself with an old language, one she had not spoken aloud in years but had never truly forgotten. And then, with a movement so subtle it might have been missed if anyone had blinked, her fingers rose and hovered above the keyboard, not trembling, not uncertain, but perfectly still. And in that instant, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, the kind of silence that does not come from absence of sound, but from the anticipation of it. And even those who had moments ago been whispering or smiling now found themselves leaning forward slightly, drawn in by something they could not quite define. And somewhere in the back of the hall, a program slipped from someone's hand and fell softly to the floor, the faint sound echoing more loudly than it should have in the stillness. And yet Clara did not react, her focus unbroken, her presence no longer that of a background figure, but something else entirely, something centered, something undeniable. And as her fingertips finally touched the keys, resting there with quiet intention, it became clear, though no one would yet say it aloud, that whatever was about to happen would not follow the script they had so confidently imagined. The first note did not strike the air the way anyone expected. It did not hesitate. It did not falter. It simply appeared, clear and precise, like a drop of water falling into absolute stillness. And for a fraction of a second the room did not react at all, as though it needed time to understand what it had just heard. And then the second note followed, and the third, each one placed with such control and intention that the very texture of the silence began to change, no longer filled with doubt but something far more attentive. And Clara Bennett did not rush. She did not perform for approval. She allowed the music to unfold at its own pace, her fingers moving across the keys with a calm assurance that did not belong to someone improvising or guessing, but to someone who knew exactly where every note lived. And in the front row a man who had been preparing to check his watch slowly lowered his hand, his attention pulled back without him realizing it, while a pair of students who had exchanged amused glances moments earlier now sat completely still, their expressions tightening into something more focused, more uncertain. And behind them one of the instructors leaned forward slightly, his earlier smile fading as his eyes narrowed, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he believed he knew. And on stage Maestro Halvorsen held his baton in midair, waiting for the moment he would need to intervene, to guide, to correct. But that moment did not come. Instead the music continued, building not in volume but in depth, layers revealing themselves with quiet confidence, each phrase shaped with care, each transition seamless, as though the piece itself had been waiting for this exact interpretation. And Clara remained composed, her posture relaxed yet precise, her gaze steady on the keys, never searching, never questioning. And there was something else now. Something that could not be taught in classrooms or rehearsed in practice rooms. Something that moved beneath the notes like an undercurrent, subtle but undeniable, and it began to reach the audience in ways they had not anticipated, because this was no longer a performance they were evaluating. It was something they were experiencing, and the shift happened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A patron in the third row leaning forward, a professor lowering his program, a student forgetting to whisper, until the entire hall seemed to align itself around the sound, drawn into its rhythm. And still Clara did not look up, did not acknowledge the change, as though she were playing for something beyond the room itself, something internal, something long held and now quietly released. And the orchestra, which had been prepared to follow under strict direction, began to respond differently as well, their entries aligning naturally with her tempo, their dynamics adjusting without command, as if they too sensed that the control of the piece had shifted without anyone formally declaring it. And Maestro Halvorsen's grip on the baton tightened just slightly, a subtle reaction that would have gone unnoticed by most. But those closest to him could see it, the faint crease forming between his brows, the smallest delay in his movement, because what he was witnessing did not fit the pattern he had expected. And for the first time that evening his gaze moved not across the ensemble, not toward the audience, but directly toward Clara Bennett, studying her, searching for something that would explain the precision, the clarity, the unmistakable authority in her playing. And yet she offered no explanation, only the music, continuing, evolving, deepening. And as the piece moved into a more intricate passage, one that demanded both technical mastery and emotional restraint, the room held its breath once more. But this time it was not out of anticipation of failure. It was something entirely different, something closer to disbelief, because the woman they had dismissed so easily was not just keeping up with the composition, she was shaping it, guiding it, revealing dimensions within it that few in that hall had ever truly considered. And the realization began to spread, quiet but undeniable, moving from one listener to the next like a ripple across still water, until even those who had been most certain of the outcome found themselves sitting motionless, their earlier assumptions dissolving with each passing measure. And in that growing silence, filled now not with doubt, but with something far more profound, the truth of the moment began to take form, though no one had yet found the words to speak it. By the time the music reached its turning point, something irreversible had already taken hold of the room, the kind of shift that no one announces but everyone feels, and Clara Bennett no longer appeared as a substitute or an afterthought. She had become the axis around which everything else moved, her hands gliding across the keys with a precision that felt almost effortless, yet carried the weight of years no one in that audience had witnessed. And the passage before her now demanded more than technical skill. It demanded restraint, timing, and a depth of interpretation that separated the practiced from the truly masterful. And as she entered it, there was no hesitation, no visible calculation, only a quiet certainty that unfolded through each phrase. And in the front rows, the earlier skepticism had vanished entirely, replaced by an intense stillness, the kind that comes when people realize they are experiencing something they cannot easily categorize. And one of the senior faculty members, a man known for his critical standards, slowly lowered his glasses, his gaze fixed on Clara as though trying to understand how he had failed to see what was now so unmistakably present. While behind him a student who had once laughed now sat with parted lips, completely absorbed. And even the subtle sounds that usually filled such a hall, the shifting of seats, the quiet coughs, the turning of programs, had disappeared, replaced by a silence so complete it felt almost tangible. And at the center of it all stood Maestro Halvorsen, still holding his baton, yet no longer directing in the way he always had. Because something fundamental had changed, the orchestra was no longer waiting for his cues. They were following her, not out of defiance but out of instinct, responding to the clarity of her timing, the confidence of her phrasing. And for the first time in years, perhaps decades, the maestro found himself in unfamiliar territory, observing rather than controlling. And it showed in the smallest of ways, a slight delay in his movements, a subtle tightening in his jaw, a flicker of something that was not quite discomfort, but no longer certainty either. And as the music swelled into a more complex sequence, one that intertwined delicate runs with sudden dynamic shifts, Clara's expression remained composed, yet there was an intensity beneath it now, a quiet force that seemed to draw every note into alignment with her intention, and the audience could feel it, not as something loud or overwhelming, but as something deeply precise, like watching a perfectly balanced structure reveal itself piece by piece. And then came the moment that would have exposed any weakness, a rapid progression that required both speed and absolute control, the kind of passage that even seasoned performers approached with caution. And as Clara's fingers moved through it, there was no strain, no visible effort, only clarity, each note articulated with such exactness that it seemed to resonate longer than it should have, filling the space with a richness that lingered. And somewhere near the back of the hall, a quiet voice whispered, almost involuntarily, "That is not possible," though no one turned to see who had spoken, because every eye remained fixed on the stage, and Maestro Halvorsson's baton, which had been held with unwavering steadiness throughout countless performances, shifted ever so slightly in his grasp, his attention now fully locked on Clara, not as a participant in the performance, but as its center, and there was a growing realization in his gaze, one that moved slowly but carried undeniable weight, because what he was witnessing could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or hidden familiarity. It was something far more significant, something that challenged the assumptions he had carried into that evening. And as the piece approached its final movement, the tension in the room did not release. It deepened, drawing every listener further in, as though they were all collectively holding their breath, waiting not for the end, but for the moment when what they were beginning to understand would become impossible to deny. And Clara, still seated at the piano, still composed, gave no outward sign of what that realization might mean. She simply continued, her hands steady, her presence unwavering, guiding the music forward with a quiet authority that no longer asked for recognition, because it had already taken it. The final movement did not arrive with a sudden burst, but with a quiet inevitability, as though the music itself had been building toward this moment long before anyone in that hall had taken their seats. And Clara Bennett did not rush to meet it. She allowed it to unfold with deliberate control, her hands moving with a fluid precision that seemed to dissolve the boundary between intention and execution. And by now there was no trace of the uncertainty that had once surrounded her presence. Only a steady command that held the entire room in its grasp. And as the notes rose and fell with increasing complexity, weaving together layers of sound that demanded absolute focus, the audience leaned further forward, drawn in not by spectacle, but by something far more compelling, the unmistakable sense that they were witnessing mastery revealed in real time. And Maestro Halvorsson, still positioned at the center of the orchestra, found himself no longer leading but following, his baton hovering in the air with diminishing purpose. Because every cue he might have given had already been anticipated, every transition he might have shaped had already been defined, and for the first time in his long and celebrated career, the structure he relied upon had shifted beyond his control, not in chaos but in perfect alignment, guided by someone he had moments ago dismissed. And the realization settled slowly but firmly, reflected in the subtle changes of his posture, the slight lowering of his shoulders, the way his gaze remained fixed on Clara not with authority, but with something closer to recognition. And still she did not acknowledge him, her focus unwavering, her expression calm, as though the world beyond the keys no longer existed. And the orchestra responded with an almost instinctive cohesion, their timing aligning seamlessly with hers, their dynamics shaped by the clarity of her interpretation. Until it became impossible to distinguish where one influence ended and another began. And as the final passages approached, the music did not simply conclude, it transformed, softening into a sequence so delicate it seemed to suspend time itself, each note placed with care, each pause carrying weight, and the hall, filled with hundreds of people, remained completely silent, not out of politeness but out of something deeper, a shared understanding that this moment could not be interrupted. And then, with a final progression that resolved not in grandeur, but in quiet certainty, Clara brought the piece to its close, her fingers lifting gently from the keys as the last note lingered in the air, fading slowly into stillness. And for a heartbeat, perhaps longer, Nothing happened. No applause. No movement. Only a profound silence that held the entire room in place. And in that silence, the truth of what had just occurred settled fully into every listener. Undeniable, irreversible, and at the center of it all, Maestro Halvorsen stood motionless, his baton slipping ever so slightly in his grasp, his composure fractured not by error, but by revelation. And when it finally fell from his hand, the soft sound it made against the polished floor echoed far louder than it should have, marking the moment in a way no words could, because it was not simply an object that had been dropped. It was the quiet collapse of an assumption, the undeniable acknowledgement that the woman he had underestimated had just redefined the very standard he believed he upheld. And still Clara remained seated, her posture unchanged, her presence calm, as though she had not performed for their recognition at all, as though the music itself had been the only thing that mattered. And in the lingering silence that followed, the entire room seemed to understand, without anyone needing to say it, that they had just witnessed something rare, something that could not be reduced to explanation, something that would not be forgotten. For a moment longer than anyone could measure, the silence held, not fragile but absolute, as though the entire hall had been suspended outside of time, and Clara Bennett remained exactly where she was, her hands resting lightly above her lap, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze lowered not in hesitation but in quiet completion, as if what needed to be said had already been spoken through the music and required no further explanation. And then, somewhere in the back of the room, a single breath escaped, barely audible, followed by another, and the stillness began to shift, not breaking all at once, but unfolding in layers, as though each person present needed a moment to return to themselves, to reconcile what they had just witnessed with everything they had assumed before it began. And in the front row, a woman who had spent the evening evaluating every performer with practiced detachment slowly brought her hands together. The first clap soft but unmistakable, and it echoed in the silence with a clarity that carried across the hall, drawing every eye toward her for just a fraction of a second before the reaction spread, one pair of hands after another, until the applause began to build, hesitant at first, then gathering strength, not as polite acknowledgement, but as something far more genuine, something earned. And Clara did not immediately respond. She did not stand or bow or acknowledge the rising sound. She simply remained still, as though allowing the moment to belong to the music rather than herself. And on the stage behind her, Maestro Halvorsen had not yet moved, his baton now resting on the floor where it had fallen, his hand empty, his posture altered in a way that no audience member would have expected, because the certainty that had once defined him had been replaced by something quieter, something more reflective. And as the applause continued to grow, he took a slow step forward, not with the commanding presence he was known for, but with a measured restraint, his eyes fixed on Clara as though seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her beyond the assumptions that had shaped his earlier judgment. And when he reached the piano, he paused, the distance between them small but significant, and for a brief moment it seemed as though he might speak, might attempt to reclaim the narrative of the evening with some formal acknowledgement. But no words came, because whatever explanation he might have offered would have felt insufficient in the face of what had just occurred. And instead he inclined his head, a gesture so subtle that many in the audience might have missed it, yet unmistakable to those who understood its meaning, a quiet recognition, not of a performance, but of mastery. And only then did Clara rise from the bench, her movements calm and unhurried, her expression unchanged, and as she turned to face the audience, the applause swelled once more, filling the hall with a resonance that seemed to echo beyond its walls. Yet even in that moment, she did not seek the spotlight, did not draw attention to herself. She simply stood there, present, composed, as though the recognition belonged not to her, but to something greater than individual acclaim. And in the rows of seats stretching back beneath the chandeliers, the reactions continued to ripple outward, students exchanging stunned glances, professors sitting in thoughtful silence, patrons leaning forward as though trying to hold on to the fading notes of what they had just experienced. And among them, one voice rose just enough to be heard by those nearby, a quiet whisper that carried a different kind of weight. Clara Bennett, it said, the name spoken not with confusion now, but with recognition. And another voice responded, equally hushed. I thought she left years ago. And the realization moved through that small circle like a spark, spreading quietly, connecting fragments of memory and reputation that had once existed but had somehow been forgotten. And on the stage, Clara heard none of it. Or perhaps she heard it and chose not to react, because her gaze remained steady, her posture unchanged, her presence as grounded as it had been before a single note was played. And as the applause gradually settled into a softer rhythm, something deeper lingered in its place. Not excitement, not spectacle, but respect, the kind that does not demand attention but remains long after the moment has passed. And in that lingering silence between claps, between breaths, between thoughts, the room itself seemed to understand that what had just been revealed could not be undone, that the quiet woman they had overlooked had not simply stepped into the spotlight. She had redefined it, and nothing in that hall would feel quite the same again. The applause did not end all at once. It lingered in waves, rising and falling as though the audience itself could not quite let go of what had just taken place. And Clara Bennett stood quietly at the center of it, neither absorbing the attention nor deflecting it, simply existing within it with a calm that felt almost separate from the moment, as if the recognition surrounding her belonged to a different space entirely. And gradually, as the sound softened, something else began to take its place, a subtle current of curiosity that moved through the rows of seats, whispers returning, but now carrying a different tone, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but searching, trying to understand, trying to piece together the identity of the woman who had just reshaped the evening without warning. And in the front rows, a senior donor leaned toward a faculty member, his voice low but intent, asking a question that had suddenly become urgent. Who is she? And the faculty member hesitated, his earlier certainty gone, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty that revealed more than any answer could. Because for all their expertise, for all their years within those walls, they had no immediate explanation to offer, and that absence spoke louder than any introduction ever could. And on stage, Maestro Halvorsen finally bent down, retrieving the baton from the polished floor with a measured movement. Though when he straightened, he did not resume his position at the center. He remained slightly to the side, as though acknowledging, without words, that the focus of the room had shifted beyond his reach, and his gaze returned to Clara once more, not with the authority he had carried earlier, but with something quieter, something that suggested he was re-examining more than just the performance. And Clara, sensing the shift in the room though not reacting outwardly to it, inclined her head slightly toward him in a gesture that was neither deferential nor dismissive, but balanced, as if recognizing his presence without surrendering her own. And then, without waiting for further acknowledgement, she stepped away from the piano bench, her movements as composed as they had been when she first approached it, and began to walk toward the edge of the stage, not lingering for applause, not seeking validation, simply moving forward with a quiet intention that seemed to guide her away from the spotlight rather than deeper into it. And this, more than anything, unsettled the expectations of those watching, because they had prepared themselves for a revelation, a speech, a moment of explanation that would neatly resolve the tension of what they had witnessed. But Clara offered none of it. She allowed the silence to speak where words would have diminished the truth. And as she reached the curtain, the soft rustle of fabric marking her transition from the brilliance of the stage back into the shadows of the corridor, the audience leaned forward almost instinctively, as though unwilling to let her disappear without understanding. And the whispers grew again, names exchanged, fragments of memory surfacing. And somewhere near the center aisle, an older man who had remained silent throughout the entire performance finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with quiet recognition. She studied in Vienna, he said, not loudly, but with enough certainty to draw the attention of those around him. And another voice responded, uncertain but intrigued, I thought she stopped performing. And the man nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the empty stage. She did, he said, at the height of everything. And the weight of that statement settled into the space between them, suggesting a story far larger than the moment they had just witnessed. And behind the curtain, Clara paused for just a second, the distant sound of the audience still echoing faintly behind her. And though no one could see it, there was a brief stillness in her posture, as if acknowledging something only she could feel. Before she continued down the corridor, her footsteps soft against the floor, returning her once more to the quiet spaces where she had begun, and on stage, the orchestra remained seated. Instruments lowered, their expressions reflecting a mixture of admiration and disbelief, while Maestro Halvorsen stood in thoughtful silence, the baton now resting lightly in his hand, no longer a symbol of control, but a reminder of the moment it had slipped away. And in the lingering hush that followed Clara's exit, the room itself seemed to hold on to her absence as much as her presence, as if the echo of what she had revealed could not simply fade, because some performances end when the music stops, but others continue long after the final note has disappeared, carried not by sound, but by the quiet realization that something extraordinary had been hidden in plain sight all along. The corridor beyond the stage felt quieter than it had only minutes before, as though the sound of the performance had been left behind like a distant echo that could not quite follow Clara Bennett into the dimly lit passageway. And her footsteps, soft and measured, carried her away from the brilliance of the hall without hesitation, without pause, as if she had always intended to leave the moment exactly where it belonged. And behind her, the muffled hum of voices began to rise once more, not in applause now, but in conversation, the kind that grows when people realize they have witnessed something they cannot easily explain. And on the stage, the orchestra slowly began to stir, musicians exchanging glances that carried more questions than answers, while Maestro Halvorsen remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the empty space where Clara had been seated. And there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not confusion, not even disbelief, but a quiet reckoning, as though he were revisiting every assumption that had led him to that moment. And when he finally turned, it was not with the commanding authority that had defined his presence earlier, but with a measured calm, his steps deliberate as he addressed the audience, though his voice, when it came, carried none of the certainty they had expected. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, and for a brief second he paused, the silence stretching just long enough to reveal that whatever he had planned to say no longer fit the moment, and instead he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no elaboration, and stepped back, allowing the weight of what had just occurred to stand on its own. And in the rows beneath the chandeliers, the conversations continued, fragments of memory surfacing, names recalled, stories pieced together. And the realization spread quietly but steadily that Clara Bennett was not a newcomer, not an assistant who had unexpectedly risen to the occasion, but someone whose absence had been as significant as her presence, someone who had once stood in the very spotlight she had just walked away from. And the contrast between those two truths settled deeply into the room, because it forced a question no one could ignore, not about her, but about themselves, about how easily they had overlooked what did not present itself in the way they expected. And beyond the stage, further down the corridor, Clara reached the small service door that led out into the cool evening air, and when she stepped outside, the quiet of the night greeted her without ceremony, the distant glow of streetlights reflecting softly against the pavement. And for a moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the stillness, the absence of expectation, the absence of scrutiny, and there was no triumph in her expression, no visible sense of victory, only a calm that suggested she had never needed the recognition to begin with, because what she carried did not depend on an audience. And as she began to walk away from the building, her figure gradually blending into the soft shadows of the street, the sound of her steps faded into the distance, leaving nothing behind but the memory of what had been revealed. And inside the hall, long after the performance had ended, the atmosphere remained altered, quieter, more reflective, as though the walls themselves held on to the echo of something that could not be undone. And in that lingering stillness, the lesson of the evening did not arrive as a spoken conclusion or a formal acknowledgement. It settled instead in the minds of those who had witnessed it, in the subtle shift of perspective that would follow them. Beyond that night, because sometimes the most powerful moments do not demand attention. They simply reveal what has always been there, waiting to be seen, and in the quiet that remained, that truth stood unchallenged, unmistakable, and complete.